The morning sun cast long shadows across the military checkpoint as Sergeant Marcus Rivera adjusted his uniform and prepared for another routine day. The border station had been quiet for weeks, with only the usual flow of civilians and low-ranking personnel passing through. Rivera had grown comfortable in his position, confident in his authority and quick to assert his dominance over anyone who seemed out of place. At exactly 0800 hours, a dusty jeep approached the checkpoint. Rivera squinted against the glare, watching as the vehicle came to a stop at the security barrier. The driver stepped out slowly, and Rivera's eyebrows rose in surprise. It was a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing what appeared to be standard military fatigues. Her uniform was clean but showed signs of field wear, and her boots were scuffed from obvious use. Rivera's fellow guards gathered around, their curiosity piqued. Women in combat roles were becoming more common, but this particular checkpoint rarely saw female personnel, especially not alone. The woman approached with confident strides, her posture straight and professional. She carried herself with an unmistakable air of authority. But Rivera was too focused on what he perceived as an opportunity to flex his own power. "Hold it right there," Rivera called out, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. "This is a restricted military zone. State your business." The woman stopped a few feet away and reached slowly toward her chest pocket. "I need to pass through to reach the command center," she said calmly, her voice steady and clear. "I have orders to report to Colonel Henderson immediately." Rivera let out a short laugh, and his fellow guards exchanged amused glances. "Orders? From who exactly?" He looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. "You don't look like any soldier I've seen around here. What unit are you supposed to be with?" The woman's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that should have warned Rivera to proceed with caution. Instead, he felt emboldened by what he mistook for weakness. "I'm waiting for an answer, soldier," he said, emphasizing the last word with clear condescension. "I'm with the 82nd Airborne Division," she replied evenly, "and I really do need to get through." This only seemed to amuse Rivera more. The 82nd Airborne was an elite unit, known for its rigorous training and high standards. The idea that this lone woman could be associated with such a prestigious division struck him as absurd. "The 82nd?" he scoffed. "Right. And I suppose you're some kind of war hero too?" The other guards chuckled nervously. Something about the woman's demeanor was beginning to make them uncomfortable, but Rivera was too caught up in his performance to notice. He had an audience, and he was determined to make the most of it. "Look, lady," Rivera continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't some tourist attraction. This is a real military installation with real security protocols. If you think you can just walk up here with some story about the 82nd Airborne and expect us to roll out the red carpet, you're seriously mistaken." The woman's hand moved again toward her pocket, but Rivera quickly stepped closer. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. "For all we know, you could be anyone. A reporter, a spy, maybe just some crazy person who got hold of a uniform." Sergeant Rivera, one of the younger guards, said quietly, "Maybe we should let her show us her identification." Rivera shot him a withering look. "I'll decide when and if she gets to show us anything, Private. This is my checkpoint, and I run things here." He turned back to the woman, his confidence growing with each passing moment. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around, get back in that Jeep, and drive away. And if you're smart, you won't come back." The woman remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. "Sergeant, I understand you're doing your job, but I really do need to pass through. If you'll just allow me to show you my credentials." "Credentials?" Rivera interrupted with a bark of laughter. "What credentials could you possibly have that would impress me?" He gestured broadly to encompass the checkpoint and his men. "I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've served in 3 combat zones. I've earned my stripes the hard way, through blood, sweat, and dedication. And you think you can just show up here and demand respect?" The tension at the checkpoint was becoming palpable. The other guards were shifting uncomfortably, sensing that something was not quite right about the situation. The woman's calm demeanor, in the face of Rivera's increasingly hostile behavior, was unsettling. Most people, when confronted by an angry sergeant at a military checkpoint, would become defensive, argumentative, or intimidated. This woman seemed almost amused. "I'm not demanding anything, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I'm simply asking to pass through, so I can report as ordered." Surely that's not unreasonable. Rivera stepped even closer, now standing barely 3 feet away from her. "You want to know what's unreasonable? What's unreasonable is some civilian thinking she can dress up like a soldier and waltz into a military zone. What's unreasonable is expecting me to believe that someone like you could have any legitimate business with Colonel Henderson." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Someone like me? You know exactly what I mean," Rivera said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think because you put on a uniform and learned a few military terms, you can fool real soldiers? I've seen your type before. Wannabes, posers, people who think they understand what military service means, but have never actually served a day in their lives." At this point, several more guards had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading through the checkpoint that Sergeant Rivera was having a confrontation with some woman who claimed to be military. Some of the soldiers were beginning to look genuinely concerned, while others seemed to be enjoying the show. 12 years I've been doing this job," Rivera continued, his voice rising. 12 years of following orders, respecting the chain of command, and earning my place in this man's army. And you think you can just show up and expect the same respect that I've worked my entire career to earn?" The woman listened patiently to his entire tirade, never interrupting, never showing any sign of anger or frustration. When Rivera finally paused to catch his breath, she spoke again, her voice still calm and measured. "Sergeant, I appreciate your dedication to your duty, truly, but I think there might be a misunderstanding here. If you'll just allow me to show you my identification, I believe we can clear this up very quickly." Rivera's face was now red with anger and exertion. "Misunderstanding? The only misunderstanding here is yours. You seem to think that I'm some kind of pushover who's going to be impressed by whatever fake ID you've cooked up." He began to pace back and forth in front of her, his agitation growing with each step. "You want to know what really gets me? It's people like you who make a mockery of everything we stand for. While real soldiers are out there risking their lives, serving their country with honor and dignity, you're playing dress-up and trying to steal some of that glory for yourself." The woman's expression finally showed a hint of emotion, but it wasn't anger or embarrassment. It looked almost like pity. "Sergeant Rivera," she said softly, "you really should let me show you my credentials." "Should?" Rivera exploded. "Did you just tell me what I should do?" He whirled around to face his men. "Did you hear that? This civilian just told me, a United States Army sergeant, what I should do." The guards were now looking genuinely uncomfortable. The situation was escalating beyond what anyone had expected, and several of them were beginning to wonder if they should intervene. But Rivera was their superior, and military protocol demanded that they follow his lead unless he was clearly in the wrong. "Here's what I should do," Rivera continued, turning back to face the woman. "I should have you arrested for impersonating a member of the armed forces. That's a federal crime, you know. You could go to prison for what you're doing right now." The woman sighed quietly, a sound so soft that only Rivera could hear it. "Sergeant, I'm going to ask you one more time to let me show you my identification. After that, I'm afraid I'll have to insist." Rivera's eyes widened in disbelief. "Insist? You'll insist?" He threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the checkpoint. "That's rich. That's really rich." He looked around at his men again, making sure he had their full attention. "Boys, I want you to remember this moment. This is what happens when civilians think they can intimidate real soldiers. This is what delusion looks like." Turning back to the woman, Rivera's expression became deadly serious. "Let me make something crystal clear to you, lady. I don't care who you think you are. I don't care what kind of story you've prepared, and I certainly don't care about whatever fake identification you're carrying around in that pocket." He took another step closer, now standing close enough that she could feel his breath on her face. You are not getting through this checkpoint. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And if you don't turn around and leave right now, I'm going to have you arrested for trespassing on a military installation." The woman looked at Rivera for a long moment, her eyes steady and unflinching. Then, without warning, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, or an amused smile. It was the kind of smile that made Rivera suddenly realize he might have made a terrible mistake. "Sergeant Rivera," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "I tried to do this the easy way." Before Rivera could respond, she reached into her chest pocket and withdrew a small leather folder. As she opened it, the morning sun caught the metal insignia inside, causing it to gleam brilliantly in the light. Rivera's eyes focused on the folder, and his expression began to change. The confident smirk faded from his face, replaced by confusion, then growing alarm. The other guards craned their necks to see what was in the folder, but from their position, they could only make out Rivera's increasingly horrified expression. "No," Rivera whispered, his voice barely audible. That can't be." The woman held the folder steady, allowing him to examine its contents thoroughly. "Would you like me to repeat my name and rank, Sergeant?" Rivera's hands began to shake as he stared at the identification folder. The insignia inside was unmistakable. A silver eagle, the symbol of a full colonel in the United States Army. But it was the name printed below it that made his blood run cold. Colonel Sarah Chen, 82nd Airborne Division. The silence at the checkpoint stretched for what felt like an eternity. Rivera's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The other guards, sensing that something significant was happening but unable to see the identification themselves, began to shift nervously. "Sergeant," Colonel Chen said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command experience. "I believe you have something to say to me." Rivera's face had gone from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Colonel, I didn't," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Private Williams, the youngest guard at the checkpoint, finally found the courage to speak up. "Sergeant Rivera? What's going on? Who is she?" Rivera couldn't answer. He was still staring at the identification, trying to process what he was seeing. Colonel Chen closed the folder and returned it to her pocket, then looked around at the assembled guards. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the checkpoint. "I am Colonel Sarah Chen, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division. I am here on direct orders from General Morrison to conduct an unscheduled inspection of this facility and its security protocols." The words hit the guards like a physical blow. Several of them immediately snapped to attention, their training taking over even as their minds struggled to comprehend what was happening. Rivera remained frozen in place, still processing the enormity of his mistake. Colonel Chen continued, her tone professional, but with an underlying steel that made every man present understand that this was not a woman to be trifled with. "I arrived here this morning expecting to conduct a routine evaluation of your checkpoint procedures. Instead, I've been subjected to harassment, discrimination, and gross insubordination from your sergeant." Private Williams swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we didn't know. Sergeant Rivera didn't tell us." "At ease, Private," Colonel Chen said, her expression softening slightly when she looked at the younger soldiers. "This isn't about you or the other men here. This is about a failure of leadership and a complete breakdown of military protocol." She turned her attention back to Rivera, who was still standing frozen like a deer caught in headlights. "Sergeant Rivera, are you going to continue standing there gaping? Or are you going to explain to me why you felt it was appropriate to question my credentials, mock my service record, and threaten to have me arrested?" Rivera's mouth worked soundlessly for several more seconds before he finally managed to speak. "Colonel, I apologize. I didn't realize. I couldn't have known." "Couldn't have known what?" Colonel Chen's voice was sharp now, cutting through his excuses like a knife. Couldn't have known that you should treat all military personnel with respect until proven otherwise? Couldn't have known that proper protocol requires you to examine identification before making assumptions? Or couldn't have known that women serve in combat roles in today's army? Each question hit Rivera like a punch to the gut. Around them, the other guards watched in horrified fascination as their sergeant, the man who had seemed so confident and in control just minutes earlier, crumbled under the colonel's interrogation. "All of the above, ma'am," Rivera finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Colonel Chen nodded slowly. "I see. And tell me, Sergeant, what exactly was it about my appearance that made you so certain I couldn't possibly be a real soldier?" Rivera's face flushed red again, but this time it was shame rather than anger. I don't know, ma'am." "You don't know?" Colonel Chen's eyebrows rose. "That's interesting. Because from where I was standing, it seemed like you had very definite opinions about my qualifications based solely on your first impression. Would you care to share what those opinions were based on?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Everyone present understood that this was more than just a dressing down for a security protocol violation. This was about something deeper and more troubling. Rivera's shoulders sagged. "Ma'am, I was wrong. I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate and unprofessional." "What kind of assumptions, Sergeant?" The colonel's persistence was relentless. But Rivera could see that she wasn't asking these questions out of cruelty. She was making a point that needed to be made, not just for him but for all the men watching. "I assumed that because you were a woman, you couldn't be a real soldier," Rivera admitted, his voice thick with shame. "I thought you were some kind of fraud or imposter. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment." Colonel Chen nodded. "At least you're honest. That's something." She paused for a moment, studying Rivera's face. "Tell me about your service record, Sergeant. You mentioned 12 years in the Army." Rivera straightened slightly, grateful for what seemed like a change of subject. "Yes, ma'am. I enlisted right out of high school. I've done 3 tours overseas, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. I've been stationed at 7 different bases and received commendations for—" "Stop." Colonel Chen held up her hand. "I'm not interested in your commendations right now. I want to know about your experience serving with women in the military." Rivera's face fell again. "Ma'am, it's a simple question, Sergeant. In your 12 years of service, how many women have you served alongside?" Rivera thought for a moment. "Quite a few, ma'am. In recent years especially." "And how did those women perform their duties?" They performed them well, ma'am. Very well. In most cases." Colonel Chen's expression remained neutral. "In most cases?" "In all cases, ma'am," Rivera corrected quickly. "The women I've served with have been excellent soldiers." "Then explain to me, Sergeant, why you assumed I couldn't be one of them." Rivera had no answer for that. The logic was inescapable. If he had served alongside competent female soldiers for years, why had he automatically assumed this woman was a fake? Colonel Chen seemed to read his thoughts. "Let me help you understand something, Sergeant Rivera. I've been in the Army for 16 years. I graduated first in my class at West Point. I've commanded units in 4 combat zones. I've earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Action Badge. I've led men and women through some of the most dangerous missions our military has undertaken in the past decade." She paused, letting that information sink in. "But none of that matters to you, does it? Because when you looked at me, all you saw was a woman. And in your mind, women don't belong in real military roles." Rivera wanted to protest, to defend himself, but he knew she was right. Every word she spoke was true, and they both knew it. "The tragedy here, Sergeant, isn't just that you disrespected a superior officer. It's that you've learned nothing from your own experiences. You've worked with capable female soldiers. You've seen them prove themselves time and again. And yet when faced with an unknown woman in uniform, you immediately defaulted to skepticism and hostility." Private Williams and the other guards were hanging on every word. This wasn't just a lesson for Rivera. It was a lesson for all of them. Colonel Chen continued, What you did here today wasn't just unprofessional. It was a betrayal of every female soldier who has ever served with honor and distinction. You essentially declared that their service, their sacrifice, and their achievements are somehow less valid than yours simply because of their gender. Rivera's head dropped. Ma'am, I never thought of it that way. No. You didn't think at all. That's the problem. Colonel Chen's voice softened slightly. Sergeant, I've dealt with men like you before. Good soldiers who somehow convince themselves that their prejudices are actually professional standards. The difference is, most of them learn from their mistakes. She looked around at the other guards. I want all of you to understand something. The modern military is an integrated force. Women serve in every capacity. From frontline combat to command positions. They've proven themselves on battlefields around the world, and they've earned the right to be treated with the same respect and professionalism that you would show any male soldier. Turning back to Rivera, she continued, Your behavior today was a disgrace to your uniform and to the values our military represents. But more than that, it was dangerous. What if I had been an enemy infiltrator? What if my credentials had been fake? Instead of following proper security protocols, you were so focused on asserting your superiority over someone you perceived as weak that you failed to do your actual job. Rivera's eyes widened as the implications of her words hit him. She was right. His prejudice had made him careless. He had been so focused on putting her in her place that he had completely ignored basic security procedures. A real security threat would have taken advantage of your arrogance and your assumptions, Colonel Chen said. They would have counted on exactly the kind of behavior you displayed today. In your eagerness to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you, you created a massive security vulnerability. The colonel looked at her watch. I was supposed to be at the command center 20 minutes ago for a briefing with Colonel Henderson about improving security at remote installations. I suppose I now have some very specific recommendations to make. Rivera felt his career flashing before his eyes. Colonel, please. I know I made a mistake, but a mistake? Colonel Chen's voice was sharp again. Sergeant, what happened here today wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidents, errors in judgment made under pressure or due to incomplete information. What you did was deliberate. You made a conscious choice to treat me with disrespect based solely on your own prejudices. She paused, studying his face carefully. However, I'm going to give you an opportunity to redeem yourself. Not because you deserve it, but because the Army needs leaders who can learn from their failures and become better. Rivera looked up hopefully. Yes, ma'am. Anything. You're going to write a detailed report about what happened here today. You're going to analyze your own behavior, identify the specific failures in your thinking, and develop a comprehensive plan for ensuring this never happens again. You're also going to recommend additional training protocols for your entire unit. Colonel Chen's expression remained stern. Furthermore, you're going to personally oversee the implementation of new sensitivity and bias training for all personnel under your command. And you're going to do all of this while maintaining the highest standards of professionalism and security at this checkpoint. Rivera nodded eagerly. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to make this right. Don't thank me yet, Sergeant. This is your last chance. If I hear about any similar incidents involving you or anyone under your command, your military career will be over. Is that understood? Perfectly understood, ma'am. Colonel Chen looked around at the other guards one final time. Gentlemen, I want you to remember what you witnessed here today. Remember that respect is earned through competence and character, not through gender or appearance. Remember that our strength as a military comes from our ability to work together as a unified force, regardless of our differences. She started walking toward her jeep, then stopped and turned back. And remember that when someone shows up at your checkpoint claiming to be military personnel, your job is to verify their credentials, not to judge their worthiness based on your own biases. As Colonel Chen drove away, the checkpoint fell into stunned silence. Rivera stood motionless, staring at the dust cloud, kicked up by her departure. The weight of what had happened was beginning to sink in. not just for him but for all the men who had witnessed it. The hours following Colonel Chen's departure were unlike anything the checkpoint had ever experienced. Word of the incident spread through the base like wildfire, carried by the guards who had witnessed the confrontation and by those who had heard second-hand accounts. Each telling seemed to add new details, and by noon, the story had taken on almost legendary proportions. Rivera spent the rest of the morning in his quarters, staring at a blank sheet of paper as he tried to begin the report Colonel Chen had demanded. Every time he put pen to paper, the magnitude of his failure overwhelmed him. How could he possibly explain what he had done? How could he analyze behavior that now seemed so obviously wrong? Private Williams knocked on his door around 1,300 hours. "Sergeant? You missed lunch. The guys are wondering if you're okay." Rivera looked up from his desk, his eyes red and exhausted. "Come in, Williams." Close the door. The young private entered cautiously. He had never seen his sergeant look so defeated. "Sir, about what happened this morning." "What about it?" Rivera's voice was flat, devoid of the confidence that usually characterized his speech. "Well, sir, some of us were talking, and we wanted you to know that we don't think any less of you. I mean, how were you supposed to know she was a colonel? She didn't look like any officer I've ever seen." Rivera studied the young man's face. Williams was trying to be supportive, but his words revealed that he had completely missed the point of what had happened. "Williams, sit down." The private took a seat across from Rivera's desk, clearly uncomfortable with the informal atmosphere. "Tell me something," Rivera said. "What do you think a colonel should look like?" Williams shifted in his chair. "Well, I guess, older, more distinguished, and usually. I mean, most of the colonels I've met have been men." Rivera nodded slowly. "And why do you think that is?" "I don't know, sir. That's just how it's always been, I guess. But it's changing, isn't it? We've got women in our unit. Staff Sergeant Martinez is one of the best soldiers I've ever served with." "Yes, sir, she's amazing. But she's not an officer. She came up through the ranks like us." Rivera leaned back in his chair. "Williams, I want you to think about something. 5 years ago, would you have believed that a woman could be as good a soldier as Martinez?" Williams thought about it. "Honestly, probably not, sir. But now you know better." "Yes, sir. So what's the difference between accepting that a woman can be a staff sergeant and accepting that a woman can be a colonel?" Williams was quiet for a long moment. I guess there isn't one." "No, there isn't. And that's the lesson I learned today, the hard way." Rivera stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the checkpoint where his entire worldview had been shattered just a few hours earlier. "Williams, I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've prided myself on being a good soldier, a good leader. But today I realized that I've been carrying around prejudices that made me a worse soldier, not a better one. Sir, when I saw Colonel Chen this morning, I didn't see a fellow soldier who might need assistance or guidance. I didn't see a potential threat that needed to be properly assessed. I saw what I thought was a weak woman trying to play soldier. And I decided to put her in her place." Rivera turned back to face Williams. "Do you understand how dangerous that was? What if she had been an enemy agent? What if she had been armed? What if she had been gathering intelligence? Instead of following security protocols, I was so busy trying to humiliate her that I became completely ineffective at my actual job." Williams nodded slowly. "I never thought about it like that." "Neither did I, until today. And that's the problem. We've been so focused on maintaining what we think military tradition looks like that we've forgotten what military effectiveness actually requires." Rivera returned to his desk and picked up his pen. "I need to write this report, Williams. And it's going to be the hardest thing I've ever written because I have to be completely honest about my own failures." "Sir, what do you think will happen?" "I don't know. Colonel Chen gave me a chance to redeem myself. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. There probably will be. And there should be." Williams stood to leave, then hesitated. "Sergeant, for what it's worth, I think what you're doing now, admitting your mistakes and trying to learn from them, that takes courage too." After Williams left, Rivera finally began to write. The words came slowly at first, But as he forced himself to confront the truth about his behavior, they began to flow more freely. He wrote about his assumptions, about the prejudices he had carried without even realizing it, about the way those prejudices had blinded him to proper procedures and professional standards. Meanwhile, at the base command center, Colonel Chen was concluding her meeting with Colonel Henderson. The conversation had not gone as either of them had expected. "Sarah, I have to ask," Colonel Henderson said as they reviewed the security protocols. "Was this really an unscheduled inspection? Or were you specifically testing for this kind of response?" Colonel Chen smiled grimly. "A little of both, Tom. General Morrison has been concerned about reports of discrimination and harassment at some of our remote installations. When I volunteered to conduct surprise inspections, I didn't expect to encounter such a blatant example on my first stop. What's your assessment?" "Mixed. The actual security infrastructure is solid. The physical barriers, communication systems, and response protocols are all well designed and properly maintained. But the human element..." She shook her head. That sergeant's behavior revealed some serious cultural problems. Colonel Henderson frowned. "Do you think it's widespread?" "I think Rivera is probably not unique. He's been in the Army for 12 years, which means his attitudes were formed during a time when women in combat roles were rare. But the military has changed faster than some of our personnel have adapted." "What do you recommend?" Colonel Chen consulted her notes. "Immediate bias and sensitivity training for all personnel at this installation. Regular diversity and inclusion assessments. And most importantly, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, regardless of the rank of the person engaging in it." What about Rivera specifically?" "I gave him a chance to redeem himself. Whether he takes advantage of it remains to be seen." "But Tom, this isn't just about punishing one sergeant. This is about making sure that every soldier in our command understands that discrimination weakens our entire force." Colonel Henderson nodded. "I'll implement your recommendations immediately." "And Sarah? Thank you for handling this personally. A lot of officers would have just filed a report and moved on. This is too important for that. These aren't just policy violations. They're threats to our operational effectiveness." 3 weeks later, Rivera stood before his assembled unit in the base's main briefing room. The diversity and inclusion training Colonel Chen had mandated was about to begin, and Rivera had volunteered to kick it off by sharing his own experience. "3 weeks ago," he began, his voice steady but humble, "I made the worst mistake of my military career. Not because I failed to follow a procedure or because I made a tactical error, but because I let my own prejudices override my judgment and my professionalism." The room was silent. Everyone present had heard about the incident, but this was the first time Rivera had spoken about it publicly. "I want to tell you what happened, not to embarrass myself, but because I think there are lessons here that all of us need to learn." Rivera proceeded to recount the entire encounter with Colonel Chen, sparing no detail and offering no excuses for his behavior. As he spoke, he watched the faces of his audience. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable, but all were paying close attention. "The point I want to make," Rivera continued, "is that I thought I was being a good soldier. I thought I was protecting military standards and maintaining proper order. But what I was really doing was undermining everything our military stands for." He paused, making eye contact with several of the younger soldiers. "Our strength doesn't come from maintaining outdated ideas about who can and can't serve effectively. Our strength comes from our ability to work together as a team, regardless of our differences, and to judge each other based on competence and character rather than appearance or background." Sergeant Martinez, who was sitting in the front row, raised her hand. "Sergeant Rivera, what would you do differently if you could do it over?" "Everything," Rivera replied without hesitation. "I would have followed proper protocol from the beginning. I would have examined her credentials immediately instead of making assumptions. And most importantly, I would have treated her with the same respect I would show any other soldier until given a specific reason to do otherwise." Private Williams spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, how do we know when we're making the same kind of mistakes you made?" It was an excellent question, and Rivera had been thinking about it for weeks. I think the key is to constantly question our own assumptions. When we react strongly to someone or something, we need to ask ourselves why. Are we responding to actual facts and evidence, or are we responding to our own biases and preconceptions? Rivera looked around the room one more time. I also think we need to remember that admitting when we're wrong isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. Colonel Chen could have destroyed my career that day, and she would have been justified in doing so. Instead, she gave me a chance to learn and grow. I want to pass that same opportunity on to all of you. The training session continued for another 2 hours, with frank discussions about bias, discrimination, and the changing nature of the modern military. For many of the participants, it was the first time they had ever seriously examined their own assumptions about gender, race, and military service. 6 months later, the checkpoint that had been the scene of Rivera's humiliation had become a model for the entire region. The security protocols were as tight as ever, but they were now implemented with a professionalism and respect that impressed every visiting dignitary and inspector. Rivera himself had been promoted to staff sergeant, though he no longer measured his success solely by rank or recognition. He had become known throughout the base as someone who could help other soldiers work through their own biases and prejudices, not through judgment or punishment, but through honest self-reflection and genuine commitment to improvement. Colonel Chen made several more visits to the installation over the following months, always unannounced, and always focused on different aspects of security and operations. Each time, she was impressed by the progress she observed. The culture at the checkpoint had fundamentally changed, not just in terms of how personnel treated women, but in how they approached diversity and inclusion in general. On her final visit, she found Rivera training a group of new recruits on proper checkpoint procedures. She watched from a distance as he patiently explained the importance of treating every person with respect while maintaining appropriate security standards. After the training session, she approached him privately. "Staff Sergeant Rivera." "Colonel Chen," Rivera replied, snapping to attention. "At ease. I wanted to congratulate you on your promotion, and to tell you how impressed I am with the changes you've implemented here." "Thank you, ma'am, but I have to say, those changes wouldn't have been possible without the lesson you taught me that day. I know you could have handled things very differently, and I'm grateful that you chose to give me a chance to learn instead of just punishing me." Colonel Chen smiled. "Staff Sergeant, the best leaders are often those who have learned from their failures. You've shown that it's possible to grow and improve, even after making serious mistakes. That's a valuable lesson for everyone in your unit." As she prepared to leave, Rivera had one final question. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how did you know to give me that chance? Why didn't you just report me and move on?" Colonel Chen considered the question carefully. "Because I saw something in your reaction that told me you were genuinely shocked by your own behavior. A lot of people, when confronted with their prejudices, become defensive or try to justify their actions. You looked horrified. That told me you had the capacity to change." She paused. "And because, Staff Sergeant, I've been in your position before. Not exactly the same situation, but I've had moments where my own assumptions and biases led me to make poor decisions. The difference is that someone gave me a chance to learn from those mistakes. I wanted to pass that forward." As Colonel Chen drove away from the checkpoint for what she knew would be the last time, she reflected on the unexpected outcome of what had started as a routine inspection. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won on battlefields or in boardrooms, but in small moments when people chose to confront their own limitations and commit to becoming better. Rivera watched her jeep disappear into the distance, then returned to his duties. The checkpoint was busy that day, with a steady stream of personnel and vehicles requiring security clearance. Each interaction was handled with professionalism and respect, regardless of the rank, gender, or background of the individuals involved. It was exactly as it should be, Rivera thought. And for the first time in months, he felt genuinely proud of the soldier he had become.